Hi, my name is American. This is a film that I worked on last year called 2015, and this was exhibited at the Queen's Museum. And it's part of an installation, but I wanted to just sort of look at some of the research I did behind this video and thinking about what went into it and what I was thinking about at the time, looking at some of the original sources that sort of gave me inspiration for this video. And so what you're looking at right now is part of a film that was shown on this large projection screen. And the film is titled 2015, and it's about 22 minutes long. And as you can see, it looks like dash cam footage, and it's essentially this dash cam footage from a police car. And this is sort of a fictionalized depiction of predictive policing software as it's used in New York State. And my interest in dashcam footage sort of started through seeing a lot of police brutality videos online, thinking about how to sort of like subvert that through ways of showing footage that doesn't spectacularize images of Black Death. But also, I just became really interested in this idea of the dashcam as this sort of like predatorial lens through which the police watch and observe and survey and ultimately end up killing people. And so this sort of began interesting for me when I was researching about Sandra Bland and what happened to her in 2015, and watching this like hour-long video that was seen millions of times on YouTube, where you see her apprehended and harassed by the police officer. And so when I was researching for this film, I started downloading a lot of found dashcam footage off like YouTube. And so these are some of the videos that I came across. And I started to like study the aesthetic of the dashcam footage and think about what it means and what it sort of like implies. What are the different like visual cues? What do you sort of recognize or see? What things are implied by the different visual languages in the different films as well. The other thing you would notice about my video is that it has this heads-up display, which is when you see the data superimposed on the windshield or the cockpit window usually you see it like in an aircraft. And when I was designing this interface, so like I said before, this is like a fictional interface for a predictive policing software. And I'll show you some images of what they actually look like. But when I was thinking about it, I wanted to refer to this military history of the heads-up display and where that comes from. And it does sort of come from aircrafts. And so these are some of the images that I was looking at when I designed that. And I was also interested formally in layering this graphic imagery onto these images of landscapes and what that visually produces. So here you can see an example of it in an aircraft. And you can kind of think of this layering of information onto your point of view as a sort of like augmented reality, in how it shifts your gaze and like what you visually recognize as like a threat or as certain types of data. Thinking of it as a predecessor to a lot of the ways we think about seeing data or recognizing images, recognizing data in the images that we see with our eyes. So my video is sort of influenced by different predictive policing softwares that are used. And in New York City, there have been many different softwares trialed and ultimately not continued. Ultimately, they ended up developing a whole different one. But this is an example of some of the actual interfaces that are used for stopping crime or preventing crime. So this is an example of one of those. It's called Copylink. This is another one that's called Mark 43. And you can see sort of aesthetically, it's like this office software, and it's not as like hyper visualized as the one that I used in my film. But the one that I focus on the most, which is called predpol, which is short for predictive policing, is one that uses geography as a way to show where a crime is more likely to take place. And it's based on past data that's accumulated by police officers, and they use that to predict where they should go patrol. And in the actual interface, all you see is these little red squares that symbolize a certain square footage where something might happen. And these little squares are refreshed every few hours. So this is actually a screenshot from their software. And this is another example of these little red squares. And here's also an image from their software where you see the squares and identified with specific addresses. So a lot of this visual graphic imagery that was used in the video, I developed in Illustrator using vector software. And so what you see for the most part is this map of Brooklyn, and that's where the video takes place. It takes place in Southeast Brooklyn. So this is the map that I'm using in the video. And if you zoom out, you can see Lower Manhattan there. And then you go further into Brooklyn, and then where you see these dots are some of the areas where you see the car patrolling in the video. And so the video starts out driving up Eastern Parkway, exits here, begins around East New York. So we have our first spot that the car starts driving through to sort of like tell people that the cops are present and you should be on guard. And then as you see them driving further, they get up near Brownsville, and then later on, as it goes further, continues around that area and then comes down to around East Flatbush. So all these areas that are heavily policed areas, you see this cop sort of driving. The thing that you'll notice that's different in my video versus what you see in a lot of these dash cam footages of police driving around is that there's no explicit violence that you see happening to anyone, but it's sort of implied by seeing this predatorial frame and then seeing every once in a while the words on the screen, crime deterred, which sort of says, you know, something happened, something went down, a crime was stopped, but you don't necessarily know what or when or why. So it has this ominous aspect that you see watching a lot of this dash cam footage, but it's just implied instead of reproducing this violent imagery that we see all the time on the internet. And then here you can see a little bit of the graphics that are used in the interface, and these are all in pieces, so then those are manipulated in After Effects for the graphic environment. So here again is the map, and this is in After Effects. We have this map, and then it's placed into the interface, and then it sort of gets distorted. So one thing I wanted to have is this view. It looks almost like you're driving around a globe because of the perspective on the map. And so if I play a little bit of this, you can see a bit of what it's like for the animation to actually take place without the footage behind it. So here you see the graphics composed onto the video, and all of this footage is something that we shot and put these together to sort of simulate a fictional but realistic account of this predictive policing software. And the video is set in 2015, and that's where the title comes from. And June 29th, 2015, that's when NYPD publicly said that they would begin trialing predictive policing software. And it's very possible that they were doing it long before that, but that's the earliest date that I could find where it was declared in public. And so I set the video to take place on that date. But it looks sort of futuristic, semi-futuristic, kind of like Minority Report style. And something I wanted to symbolize is how this thing that sounds like it's from the future, or like it sounds extremely ominous, has actually been around and been used for many years. And in some places in the country, even as far back as a decade. So in the video and the interface, you see these blinking pink squares, and those are reminiscent of what you would see in the predpool interface. So those squares symbolize where the police needs to go in order to find what they claim is a predicted crime. And the software is very much influenced by the history of policing in New York, which an important part of this early sort of statistics-based policing was CompStat, which I refer to in the video by having these statistics in the lower right corner, which are actually based on CompStat statistics. And CompStat was basically when the police first started like reporting types of crimes and the volume of crime, and they would compare it from week to week to see if there was a downturn or an upturn in crime. And even though it was all done manually, you can sort of think about that as this early form of algorithmic or statistics-based policing that now sort of haunts us with things like stop and frisk or predpool and other predictive policing software. So that's a little bit about the video, and also the inspiration, the research that went into it, and also the history of policing in New York City, which is really complex and something that we're always dealing with. So I'm glad you could join me in my virtual studio for a little bit. Thanks for stopping by.